Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. 30 years ago, at the landmark World Summit for Social Development in 1995, leaders pledged to combat poverty, achieve full employment, and foster social integration. This November, the second World Summit for Social Protection, WSSD, is coming to Doha. 30 years ago, social protection was perhaps just emerging in international fora like these as a significant tool for poverty reduction, shock response, and human development. Since then, successive financial crises, the COVID pandemic, and the increasing impacts of climate change have cemented its relevance. In today's episode, I'm speaking with colleagues from the ILO and the World Bank, co-chairs of the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or USP 2030. They are also two of the key institutions to have supported and promoted the social protection agenda internationally over this period. Today we're talking about what has changed in the past 3 decades, where to next, and how USP 2030 is working to keep social protection on the agenda in challenging times. With me for today's episode, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show Iffath Sharif, Global Director for Social Protection at the World Bank.
Hi, Joanne.
And Shahra Razavi, Director of the Social Protection Department at the International Labour Organization.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Iffath, it's 30 years since the first World Summit for Social Development was held. What was going on in the world and in international development in 1995 that provided the backdrop and impetus for that first summit?
So in 1995, the world stood at a crossroads. You had the Cold War just ending, ushering in a new global dialogue that was centered on peace, democracy, and human dignity. The long-held belief that economic growth alone would lift the poor was losing ground. And a new, bold vision emerged that growth without inclusion is unsustainable. So the first World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen marked a turning point. The Copenhagen Declaration challenged institutions to redefine success, that not only by GDP, but by lives improved, we are able to achieve sustainable development. It kind of laid the groundwork for the SDGs and a global movement for universal social protection. But I have to actually go back even prior to the 90s, because the seeds to supporting social development as a sector actually started almost 10 years before. In 1987, I recall, amid Bolivia's hyperinflation, we launched our first social safety net. It was a very modest pilot, but quite revolutionary in intent. It actually helped prove that poverty reduction wasn't just a byproduct of growth, that it was really about protecting and investing in people. And then fast forward to Yemen in 1996. This was Yemen in its post-war recovery period. Poverty was rampant. And this is where the bank actually responded with our first safety net operation called the Yemen Social Fund. And Copenhagen quite echoed those lessons, I believe, and this whole concept of protecting people, investing in people, and including the excluded was put forward and almost foundational to having a just and sustainable world. So for leadership, the message was clear that inclusive growth isn't optional, that it was essential.
Shahra, coming to you with a similar question, what stands out for you about that period?
In preparing for this podcast, I went back and I read the declaration coming out of Copenhagen, and I was reminded this was a period of optimism. It was the end of the Cold War. There was an emerging consensus around human rights. Let's remember in 1993, there was the Vienna Conference on Human Rights. Then we had also waves of democratization in Latin America, in Eastern and Central Europe, in Africa. Let's remember, it was also at the end of apartheid in South Africa, 1994. And again, 1994 was also the important International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, revolutionary in sort of recognizing sexual and reproductive health and rights. So the whole, again, rights agenda then, which was taken forward to Beijing. So really, it was a period of optimism around the human rights agenda, the end of authoritarian rule. At the same time, in terms of economic and social development, let's remember this was the end of what the Latin Americans called the lost decade of IMF, World Bank, stabilization, structural adjustment programs that had really wreaked havoc with kind of social development in many countries, particularly those that were under these programs. And then in 1987, we had that wake-up call from UNICEF, structural adjustment with a human face, that really reminded everyone about the importance of social and economic costs of kind of one-size-fits-all recipes. And it really did usher in, I think, much greater recognition of the need to kind of rehabilitate the social state, put in place new social programs. Iffath rightly referred to the so-called social funds, that this was the beginning of the World Bank coming into the kind of agenda of social protection. So the declaration was very strong in putting social development at the heart of the global development agenda, recognizing that globalization was not delivering again. And then I also looked in the text, there's a reference to social protection only about 3 times in the whole declaration, compared to 25 references in the current declaration for the summit that we're going to have in Doha. So it was kind of beginning of a recognition of the role of social protection.
Iffath, coming to you, we started to touch on some of these points, but, 30 years on from the last World Summit, what progress do you see has been made on social development, of course, social protection, and, what are those major gaps?
30 years later, what we see is what Shahra was mentioning, some of this sort of remarkable evolution in terms of ideas, at least within the World Bank. When I think of 30 years ago, where we were starting from looking at the social risk management framework, which is something that we had first used, and then eventually in 2012, really our first social protection strategy, social protection and labor strategy, was really focusing on equity, resilience, and opportunities. The links between social protection and employment support was already starting to come forward. But then when I look at the World Bank's own investments, we see that what began as small pilots actually transformed into a global portfolio of 30 billion in 76 countries, right? Where now we are reaching around 250 million people to help them withstand shocks and crises. The way we did this, again, something that Shahra mentioned, that the way we managed to have this kind of massive scale up, especially in low-income countries, is that we moved from supporting programs to systems, building comprehensive systems. That meant, funding integrated systems that combine safety nets with employment support, with skills development, and delivering the support at a large scale. So social protection 30 years on is no longer a peripheral concern. It is central to development strategies. And increasingly, we see social protection embedded in national poverty reduction plans, country after country. That said, there are gaps. Our analysis, including others from ILO and other colleagues, we know that still nearly 2 billion people in low and middle income countries still lack adequate coverage. And then over 1 billion people in Africa and South Asia alone have no protection at all. So the work is still cut out. Because what we also find from our analysis that it will take 18 years to achieve full coverage for those living in extreme poverty and 20 years to cover the poorest 20% of households in low and middle income countries if we keep at this, rate of progress. So clearly that's too long. And in that sense, it's a critical moment to think about the work that still is left for us to continue on.
Shahra, the United Nations resolved to convene this summit back in November 2021 with the intention of putting momentum behind the last 5 years of the SDGs, or before the 2030 target. However, of course, there has been a great deal of change in the global and development landscape since then. What are the major headwinds that we're facing as you see them, and how are they acting on social development?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's quite a challenging context. I'm here actually attending the International Social Security Association's World Forum on Social Security, and the theme of it is about social security in a period of transitions and big transformations. And I think I want to pick up on the first issue, that I think all countries were all confronted with, which is the issue of the climate crisis and climate change, which is bringing, I think, huge challenges to many countries. The last ILO World Social Protection report that was focusing on the whole theme of the climate crisis and the need for social protection in the context of climate action and a just transition. And I think one of the big kind of deficits that we have are that countries that are at the forefront of the climate crisis, many of them are low-income countries, some of them are small island developing states, but they're also the countries that have some of the lowest levels of social protection coverage. When you look, for example, at the 20 countries that are most vulnerable to climate crises, it's around 9% coverage. So it's really low. And in particular, I want to say these countries that have contributed least to the greenhouse gas emissions. And also they're in a very difficult position in terms of mobilizing the financing that is needed. But what it really also means is that we need to get the basics right. They need to have some sort of basic social protection floor in place. And of course, you can then need to make all the kind of adaptations that are needed to have the early warning systems, to be able to really respond quickly to climate-related shocks as well as other shocks. But getting that basics right does require building of institutions, financing to put in place the systems. I mean, the other big changes are, of course, that labor markets are constantly changing. We've just been having very important, I think, and interesting discussions here about the emergence of new forms of work, including work on digital platforms, and how to ensure that this work is decent work, that the workers who are working on these digital platforms have access to some form of social protection, this being a human right, the right to social security. And I'll just end by saying the sort of demographic change, population aging, again, is one of the big changes that countries are confronted with. We hear a lot about it in the context of the rich countries, European countries, countries that are members of the OECD. But of course, we have to remember that population aging is also happening very rapidly in many developing countries. And the requirements are, of course, having strong and robust pension systems for an aging population, but also having the right healthcare system in place, and also doing the kind of innovations that are needed for having long-term care systems, particularly in the context of population aging.
Iffath, I'd like to follow up and ask you the same question, and I guess interested in your assessment of the global development landscape, the kind of challenges that we're seeing. What's your assessment of these challenges, and what does it mean for this sort of project of trying to keep social development and social protection on the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, Joanne, we are at a stage where we're facing a perfect storm of intersecting crises. So Shahra mentioned the climate crisis, the demographic transition that is happening and what this will mean to labor markets. But then, look around, there's fragility, widening inequality, the trade shocks, the decline in ODA, development aid. And so the way we have tried or are thinking about addressing all of these challenges that are out there is by really trying to sort of focus on jobs as a way to uplift people and get them out of poverty. By 2033, the Global South will be home to 1.2 billion young people, but 300 million of them will be stuck with no access to job, will not be able to be in education or work or in training. And that's a missed opportunity for the world in terms of unleashing the human capital potential of these young people. It's something that also Shahra mentioned, right? So if you don't employ youth of today, you're not going to be able to have the pension system to support the elderly population that is coming into society at a really fast pace. 4 out of 5 workers in the Global South right now work in the informal sector. So how do you think about bringing them into productive work and giving them access to good jobs? Using social protection means as helping find pathways to gainful employment is the challenge. For us at the World Bank, what this means is making sure the policy and the regulatory environment is there. And then very critical is how to enable private sector to come in and support job creation, and really helping people get on their feet and actually have a dignified livelihood. The World Bank, we're making some ambitious commitments with 2030 in mind. Our president announced that we want to reach 500 million people with social protection and employment support by 2030. We've also announced the goal to reach 1.5 billion people with quality healthcare. We're coming together with our IFC colleagues to engage private sector. We're coming together with the guarantee side of our engagement, the MEGA colleagues, to really think about how you work with governments to de-risk some of these investments. So while we see a lot of fractured spaces in the world, we at least at the World Bank are trying to have a unified response to the current challenge that we face.
Iffath, as you started to say, that's an ambitious agenda. Financing is, of course, key. How do you see the outcomes of this year's 4th International Conference on Financing for Development? Did it do enough to unlock more financing for social development, climate transition, social protection, all of these things that we need to uplift, as you say?
I think it was, for me, particularly encouraging to see the social protection community unite under the USP 2030 umbrella at the Financing for Development event to ensure that social protection featured more prominently in both the agenda and the outcome document. And I credit Shahra and colleagues as well in the USP 2030 team for making sure that, this is very much on the agenda, the endorsement of the global commitment to expand coverage by at least 2 percentage points annually, especially in low and middle income countries, is the tangible and ambitious goal. So I think having that recognition is not enough, but it's certainly very, very important. The event also importantly recognized how critical it is to leverage a diverse mix of financing sources, right? Because obviously development assistance is not sufficient. So thinking about how do you leverage humanitarian support, development support, the climate resources, and as I mentioned earlier, critically the role of private sector, sort of bring that together with official development assistance to kind of find a way to leverage $1 into 4 to 5, right? And then thinking through how not just the financing, but the kind of interventions we put in that give you those multiplier effects on the ground. So now it's up to us really to build on it with a sense of urgency. As I said, innovation in terms of the interventions that give you a highest return. And of course, very importantly, the collaboration.
Speaking of that collaboration, Shahra, what progress did FF4D make in your view in terms of financing?
Through the FFD process, I will just recall that when the Elements paper came out for the Financing for Development, we were very disappointed to see that there was absolutely no reference to social protection. So I think this kind of galvanized us to work very closely with our USP 2030 partnership and with the member states who are part of USP 2030, as well as other member states, to really try and ensure that not only to have a recognition of the importance of universal social protection in the preambular paras, but also see if we can kind of ensure that there are also within the action paragraphs references to social protection with kind of concrete targets. So it was through that effort, through the USP 2030 partnership, we kind of looked at the data that we had to see how changes happened over the past 8-9 years. So what we could see is that from 2015 to 2023, there were 42 countries and territories, which represented a little over 50% of the global population, that these countries had achieved an average annual growth rate of social protection coverage, which was either 2 percentage points over this period per annum of extension or, even above 2 percentage points. So that's where we got that target. And from then on, it was really a question of working with the member states to get a kind of mobilization, if you like, for including a very concrete target in the outcome document. And I think the importance of it is that it really does enable the social protection institutions, ministries of labor, social development ministries to kind of talk with the ministries of finance, the ones who were very often negotiating the FFD outcome document, to say, look, I mean, there is this recognition in that outcome document. So let's try and work around this target and try and extend social protection. There needs to be, and this takes me to the next point, the effort around really having effective policies for domestic resource mobilization. I mean, ODA is an external support for many countries, is extremely volatile, quite unpredictable, and in the larger scale of things, not very significant. The lifeline of social protection systems is through social security contributions. That's why social insurance is so important. And then also from general government revenue. And for this, we really need to have a two-pronged strategy that extends social protection through the social insurance kind of mechanisms, through formalization of enterprises, of employment, to bring in the social security contributions from employers, from workers, and create that fiscal space. And at the same time, it will also, through formalization, enable greater resource mobilization, also through taxation. And this is really very much, I think, the lifeline that countries need to have in order to be able to finance nationally owned and nationally financed social protection systems.
Iffath, the World Bank and the ILO are co-hosting a side event on USP 2030 during WSSD. What do you see as the pathways to achieving universal social protection?
So achieving universal social protection is both a moral imperative and it's a practical necessity, right? And I think we discussed earlier how important social protection is as a way for people to actually get onto the first step of the jobs ladder. At least that's how we see it at the World Bank. It's just not essential for reducing poverty, but it's really important for boosting shared prosperity. We are trying to sort of help achieve that is by thinking about building the systems that can help slowly, incrementally, covering from the poorest and the most deprived in society to have that inclusion into society, all the way to making sure that we're using all kinds of new technologies, connectivity, social registries, the digital mechanisms for offering cash transfers as a way to sort of actually make sure that the delivery of programs is efficient, cost-effective, and we're always making the case, the return on investment to governments precisely for the reason that Shahra mentioned, that ultimately you will need government support and take-up of these systems and programs so that they can, over time, try to reach those who need social protection. But at the same time, given the constrained fiscal space, we need to complement that with investing in job creation and job access. And this is about supporting social insurance. How do you sort of think about productivity increase within informal sector and support the workers and reach them? These are all an incremental effort to try to having as many people with access to social protection as needed. And finally, it's really trying to make the case. It's amazing that this is one of the sectors that we have a high level, a huge amount of evidence, yet it is a sector where we need to kind of always make the case as to why investing in social protection is a smart investment and why, every single dollar invested in social protection, as we find in our analysis from Kenya, can generate $2.50 in the local economy. So social protection breaks the cycle of poverty and delivers lasting growth for people, for communities, for families, and in countries for that matter.
Interested in your views on this as well, Shahra, in terms of pathways to achieving universal social protection, and perhaps to connect it to the incremental targets that you were describing earlier.
Yeah, actually, maybe I should just say that there is this emphasis on extending social protection coverage by 2 percentage points. Not only do we have it in the FFD outcome document, we also now have it in the declaration that's going to come out of the Second World Summit for Social Development. And it's also going to be, hopefully, also in declarations that's coming out for the COP30. So I think there's a bit of momentum around this advocacy and push for extension of social protection. But to get to your specific question around the pathways, maybe it's just good to sort of remind ourselves that we are in this kind of moment of great volatility, which makes it really important to be able to manage risks collectively, based on this principle of solidarity. This is very much at the heart of the international social security standards that we have. And this is really an objective that we strive for, because the International Labour Conference, that's when all the member states of ILO, as well as workers and employers, organizations come together. So there's a real rallying cry for ensuring that this happens. And so for having social protection systems that are really robust, we know that we need to combine both contributory mechanisms, social insurance, as well as tax finance schemes in a way that is well coordinated to be able to create a kind of very broad risk pools and enable kind of consumption smoothing over the life cycle. That's the raison d'etre of having social protection, all right? And this is usually achieved in many countries through having, on the one hand, a social insurance kind of system that formalizes employment, that extends social protection coverage to more and more enterprises and diverse forms of employment, to enable the kind of transition from the informal to formal economy by extending social insurance to previously uncovered workers, usually starting with workers that have some contributory capacity, that are closer to the formal economy, because this can foster also better economic performance and it can enlarge the fiscal space. And to do so, many countries will need to really remove barriers that are there. You know, there may be legal barriers, administrative barriers to make it easier, for example, micro and small enterprises to register their workers, to make the contributions. And then on track 2, you can extend social protection to certain categories independently of their employment status, often through kind of non-contributory mechanisms. Like, for example, the National Health Service in Brazil, which is universal and tax financed. Or you have universal or quasi-universal benefits for children or persons with disabilities or older people, like many countries have, like Namibia, Nepal, South Africa. And of course, you also need social assistance for particular vulnerable populations who will not be reached through the kind of social insurance mechanisms. And this really needs to be a product of very democratic, inclusive social dialogue. And I would really like to emphasize that, where workers and employers organizations also have a key role to play in making that happen.
Iffath, there are 5 years remaining and for the achievement of the SDGs. How should we be thinking about that target given the very slow progress in many areas?
You know, as you say, with 5 years left to achieve the SDGs, the urgency is clear. But for us, so is the path forward. And I think in that space, there are 3 key elements in my mind that we need to focus on. One is, of course, the financing. We discussed that we need more and better financing, including taking advantage of digital delivery systems, taking advantage of catalytic funding to scale efforts. You know, the second space is really the knowledge, the data and evidence to guide policy reforms. And the third and very important is partnerships, strong partnerships from country-level collaboration to global alliances like the USP 2030, as well as the new alliance that we have in social protection, the G20 Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, really making sure that the partnerships that are formed around this agenda is strong. And in our own thinking, we also put forward this corporate target by saying that this we'll do along with partners. And by partners, we mean everybody working in the social protection, including governments. And so for us, having smarter investments, stronger partnerships really would be key to faster delivery of these programs and interventions to really sort of catch up to the 2030 goal. I feel quite positive that we can do it, at least achieve the 500 million target. We are doing well. We are, as we track our progress, we have 25% achievement of our target, and we have 30% of the time has elapsed since the clock starting for us to 2030. So we look forward to working with everybody and partners to write this next chapter of the 30 years of social protection. And I hope that we will be together very successful.
And finally, Shahra, 5 years to go. How do we think about taking this forward in those 5 years?
Yeah, thank you. I think many of the points have already been nicely made by Iffath. But if I can just say the sort of challenges that we face are many. I mean, I think just to set the fact that when we have seen, growth happen, it has come very often without sufficient job creation. When jobs are created, very often what we see is that many of them are precarious. The informal economy remains huge. And when jobs are created, they don't have the labor protections, the social protections that are needed. When productivity rises, wages often lag behind. So your answer was, what do we need? How do we need to get this right? And some key elements, I think we need a robust universal social protection system more than ever before, because we have the usual life cycle risks that people have, but also on top of that, we have the big shocks. The climate one was mentioned, but many others, and the big transformations that are happening. For the majority of countries, we know that universal protection is not there. We have 3.8 billion people who have no protection at all. And especially, as I said, for countries at the forefront of the climate crisis, many of them are countries that have not contributed to the warming planet, and yet they're bearing the brunt of the warming planet. So we need greater global solidarity for that, and we need to sort of be able for them to be able to mobilize resources. The issue of quality employment, decent work, especially for women and for young women and men, given the fact that many regions have very high rates of young people who are neither in employment nor education nor training. This is a huge setback after huge investments that are made in the education and training of these young women and men. So for that, we need to get the macroeconomics and other policies right to be able to have that employment generation. But we need also social protection systems that are adapted to a changing labor market, that recognize self-employment and the workers who are in micro and small enterprises. And I would say we need a global financial architecture that doesn't constantly undermine the efforts of countries to mobilize their resources. We need a global financial architecture that is far more enabling, helps them reduce illicit financial flows, helps them mobilize taxation from multinational corporations that operate in their countries so they can keep those tax resources, and that facilitates the formalization of enterprises and of employment. And I know that it's a difficult moment, but we really do need to believe that a better multilateralism is possible, one where there is greater solidarity and there is greater coherence between what countries are doing to enable a more sustainable system for people and for the planet.
Shahra, Razavi and Iffath Sharif, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you to you, Joanne, and of course, Shahra. It's been great to have this conversation, a very important one. So thank you for having me on this show.
Yeah, and I also join Iffath, Joanne, in thanking you and in thanking socialprotection.org for giving us this platform to have a conversation. I look forward to co-chairing with Iffath the USP 2030 side event that we're going to have, and look forward to further conversations on this important topic for all of us. Thank you.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news or events that have sparked their interest or that they're looking forward to and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Marta Pedrajas. Marta is Deputy Director of Multilateral Policies in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Spain. Welcome, Marta.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
In the earlier interview that we presented, we were looking ahead to the World Summit on Social Development beginning in the 4th of November. Just before that, on the 3rd of November, the first leaders' meeting of the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger will be held as a parallel event to WSSD. Spain is the co-chair of the Global Alliance along with Brazil. Why has Spain chosen to play this role in this particular global effort?
Thank you. This question is very strategic right now because we work together with Brazil under the G20 presidency. We were part of as an invited country of the G20 last year, and we work together to build the alliance. For us to work with the G20 is an opportunity to be part of this strategic leaders forum that the brings together solutions for development in our case, but also with the economy, finance, education, climate, gender, everything together. And the Global Alliance was an initiative under Lula presidency. And it is very, very natural for us to be part of it because we, as a Spanish cooperation, we have been always fighting against hunger and poverty, two of our main priorities of our master plan for international cooperation. And it's not just that it's our goal to fight against hunger and poverty. It's also like a moral value, a principles that we share with Brazil and with many other countries.
So I mentioned the first leaders meeting of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty that will be held just before the main event of the World Summit. What does that first leaders meeting aim to achieve?
It's very important in this international context we are navigating, all of us, no? With this turbulent international moment, with all this conflict, multiple crises. It's very important to bring consensus, to bring people together, to bring governments together. The Global Alliance brings not only governments, brings also civil society, academia, international financial institutions, UN agencies. So we have to bring people together in a moment that multilateralism is in crisis. And then this Global Alliance brings the action points because we are not only talking, we are acting. We are approving fast-track implementation plans. We are mobilizing school meals. We are mobilizing social protection systems. We are mobilizing all this combination of policies. I love the concept and the policy of social protection because it brings together many different policies from jobs, education, health, social security, safety nets, hunger, poverty that we need to tackle. We need to make a push for social protection, and I think this is the moment.
Ending poverty and hunger are, of course, the first two SDGs. The SDGs, as we know, are all interlinked, but nevertheless, arguably, these two are still the most fundamental and perhaps foundational aspirations. What would a big push to end poverty and hunger look like? And how do you see the prospects for success?
Well, we have the target for 2030 to end extreme poverty. And we are off track, we know. And hunger, we know that is on rise. So initiatives that the Global Alliance, all this social summit, the Finance for Development Conference, all this comes together in a moment that we really need a push on financing, that we need more finance for all the SDGs, but especially for these very human goals, that is poverty and hunger. So we need to go from paper to the implementation. And this is what the Global Alliance, for instance, has done with the state of commitment. Each country, each organization, when joins the Global Alliance, makes a state of commitment that the first point is national policies that we are already implemented in our countries and they are working well. So we can share with others, so we can really put together with others. So we have these national policies, these financing commitments, of course, sharing knowledge. If we manage policies that works with this together, I think we can achieve the end of hunger and poverty.
You mentioned financing, of course, as being really crucial to that. And as you said earlier this year, there was the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, and we dedicated an episode in the lead up to that conference as well. That conference was held in Spain, in Seville. So it seems like a really good opportunity to ask you, what you felt the key achievements and outcomes of that effort were, particularly as you were saying, financing is so crucial to the achievement of all of these goals.
Well, for Spain, it has been an honor to host this conference. It has been a big work, but we are very happy with the conference because we achieved a consensus in a moment that this multilateralism is very difficult to achieve a consensus. So the conference was really a gather of 50,000 people with 50 heads of states and government. So we really could move from the document that we already achieved, or we already agree, to the implementation. But I want to highlight 2 points about social protection because I think one is more usual to know, no? Because we are always talking about this target of the 2% of population that we want to achieve for social protection coverage. And there is a special commitment in fiscal systems with this target. But we have another target on social protection that is at the end of the document on international financial architecture that commits the IMF. And we encourage as all the countries in the Compromiso de Sevilla to take social protection in consideration in all the IMF-supported macroeconomic adjustment programs. So IMF has to take into account the social protection and social spending. And I think this is a success.
Coming to this point about financing, and you talked about the system being under a lot of pressure, obviously many Western, Northern European donors either have radically reduced the amount of ODA that they're putting into the system or they're looking to cut that over time. I believe Spain is a bit of an outlier in that respect. How has Spain been able to buck that trend?
Well, actually, we approved 2 years ago in 2023 the new law for cooperation and sustainable development that commits all the values, principles of the Spanish government, Spanish cooperation system with sustainable development goals, with international goals. And this is by law. And it was also approved by consensus in our parliament. All political parties work together for this Spanish commitment. So we have now 5 years to increase our ODA to achieve this target. We have plans, we have proposals, we're working very hard with multilateral institutions, the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation. We have reformed the Spanish system, also with a new development fund that actually was approved yesterday by Council of Ministers. So we are very committed with international solidarity. We really believe on this. And the Spanish society also support all these policies. This is very important, that the Spanish society really promote and are engaged with this policy.
And wonderful to hear that kind of bright spark amidst a situation that I think we're more often talking about the kind of gloomier aspects. Thank you so much, Marta Pedrajas, for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.